Millionaire abandons his own mother, paraplegic and battling cancer, on a deserted road, believing he'd never see her again. Years later, he turns on the TV and is shocked by what he sees. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The autumn wind whistled through the empty parking lot as Victoria Matthews wheeled herself toward the hospital entrance. Her weathered hands, once soft and manicured, now bore calluses from months of pushing herself forward. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete, and she couldn't help but notice how her own shadow seemed to stretch endlessly before her, like the uncertain path that lay ahead. "Mrs. Matthews, you're early today," Sarah, the receptionist, called out with a warm smile. The young woman's familiar face had become a beacon of comfort during Victoria's frequent visits to St. Mary's Medical Centre. "The traffic was lighter than usual," Victoria replied, managing a small smile despite the weight in her chest. She had learned to mask her pain well, a skill honed through years of navigating high society as the mother of one of the country's most prominent business magnates. Alexander Matthews, her only son, had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into Matthews Industries, a global corporation worth billions. Victoria had watched with pride as her boy climbed the ladder of success, even as she noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor, the hardening of his eyes, the calculating edge to his smile, the way he measured everything and everyone in terms of profit and loss. As she waited in the hospital lobby, Victoria's mind drifted to the accident 6 months ago. The screeching of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, and then nothing. When she awoke, the doctors delivered the news that would forever divide her life into before and after. She would never walk again. "Mrs. Matthews?" Dr. Henderson's voice pulled her from her reverie. "Please come in." The oncologist's office was bathed in morning light, but Victoria felt a chill as she wheeled herself inside. The familiar degrees and certificates on the wall seemed to mock her with their pristine order, so unlike the chaos that had become her life. "I have your test results," Dr. Henderson began, his kind face betraying a hint of concern that made Victoria's heart skip a beat. "The scans show—" A gentle knock interrupted them, and Victoria's phone buzzed simultaneously. Alexander's name flashed across the screen, a rare occurrence these days. "Excuse me, doctor, it's my son." "Mother." Alexander's voice carried its usual commanding tone. "We need to talk. I'm sending James to pick you up in an hour." "Alex, I'm in the middle of an appointment." "This can't wait. It's about your living arrangements." Victoria's stomach tightened. Since the accident, she had been staying in one of Alexander's smaller properties, a luxury apartment adapted for her needs. The staff helped with her daily routines, but lately, she had noticed them whispering, exchanging worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking. "I'll be there," she conceded, ending the call. "I'm sorry, Dr. Henderson. Could we possibly reschedule?" The doctor's expression softened with concern. "Mrs. Matthews, this is important. I understand, but my son, he rarely asks to see me these days, please." An hour later, James, Alexander's longtime chauffeur, helped Victoria into the specially equipped car. She noticed his hands trembling slightly as he secured her wheelchair, his usual professional demeanor cracking around the edges. "Is everything all right, James?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied too quickly, avoiding her eyes. "Mr. Matthews is waiting at the estate." The drive to Alexander's mansion felt longer than usual. Victoria watched the city landscape blur past her window, trying to quiet the unease growing in her chest. The manicured gardens of the estate came into view, and she spotted Alexander's tall figure standing at the top of the wheelchair ramp he had installed after her accident. Her son's expression was unreadable as James helped her up the ramp. The autumn wind had picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Victoria shivered, pulling her cardigan closer around her shoulders. "Mother," Alexander greeted her, his voice carrying none of the warmth it had held in years past. "Come inside. We have matters to discuss." The massive living room with its soaring ceilings and modern artwork had always felt cold to Victoria. Now as Alexander paced before her, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, that coldness seemed to seep into her bones. "The board meeting this morning was challenging," he began, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Our competitors are circling. They smell weakness." Victoria's brow furrowed. "Weakness?" "Yes, Mother. Weakness." Alexander stopped pacing, fixing her with a stare that made her breath catch. "The press has gotten wind of your condition. They're running stories about how Matthews Industries' CEO is distracted by family obligations. Our stock dropped 3 points this morning." "Alex, I haven't spoken to any—" "It doesn't matter," he cut her off. "Perception is reality in business. And right now, the perception is that I'm spending too much time and resources caring for my invalid mother." The word invalid struck Victoria like a physical blow. She watched her son's face, searching for any trace of the little boy who once crawled into her bed during thunderstorms, who begged her to read him one more story, who looked at her with pure love in his eyes. But that boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who measured her worth in stock points. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Alexander moved to stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her. "I've made arrangements," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're going for a drive." Chapter 2. Abandoned. The rain had started in earnest by the time Alexander's black SUV pulled onto the highway, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the downpour. Victoria sat in silence, her wheelchair secured beside her, as unfamiliar streets replaced the city's familiar skyline. Each mile that passed increased the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Alex, where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her son kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Somewhere you can't hurt the company anymore." The words hung in the air like poison. Victoria felt her world tilting on its axis, reality becoming something twisted and unrecognizable. This couldn't be happening. Not from her own son, not from the child she had raised alone after his father left, not from the boy she had supported through every failure and triumph. The city lights had long since faded when Alexander turned onto a narrow country road. The rain was falling in sheets now, obscuring everything beyond the reach of the headlights. Victoria noticed they hadn't passed another car in at least 20 minutes. "Please," she said, reaching for her son's arm. "Whatever you're thinking, we can figure this out together." Alexander jerked away from her touch, as if it burned him. "There's nothing to figure out. The board is right. You're a liability. Every minute I spend dealing with your care is a minute my competitors use against me. I can't afford distractions, not now. Is that all I am to you now? A distraction?" The SUV slowed to a stop on the shoulder of the road. Through the rain-streaked windows, Victoria could make out nothing but darkness and the shadowy shapes of trees. Alexander killed the engine, and silence fell heavy between them. "You taught me that success requires sacrifice," he said, his voice clinical and detached. "You can't build an empire if you're weighted down by weakness." "I taught you that success without compassion is meaningless," Victoria replied, her voice breaking. "I taught you that family is everything." "Family?" Alexander laughed, a harsh sound that bore no resemblance to the joyful giggle she remembered from his childhood. "Family is just another word for obligation, and obligations are luxuries I can no longer afford." He got out of the car, circling to her door. The rain plastered his expensive suit to his body as he opened the door and began unfastening her wheelchair. Victoria felt frozen, unable to process what was happening, even as he lifted her into the chair with mechanical efficiency. The rain soaked through her clothes instantly as Alexander wheeled her to the side of the road. The wheelchair's rubber grips were slick under her hands, and she could feel mud splashing up onto her legs that could no longer feel the cold or the wet or anything at all. "Alex, please," she begged, reaching for him one last time. "I'm your mother." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of doubt, a glimmer of the boy he used to be. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask of the businessman he had become. "Goodbye, Mother," he said, already turning away. "Don't try to contact me. As far as the world is concerned, you've decided to live out your days in private, away from the public eye. The story's already been planted in the press." Victoria watched, paralyzed by more than just her injury, as her son walked back to the SUV. The headlights flared to life, momentarily blinding her. Then the vehicle was moving, tires spraying mud and gravel as it accelerated away, leaving her alone in the darkness and the rain. The thunder rolled overhead, and Victoria felt the first sob break free from her chest. All around her, the storm raged, but she barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to this moment, this impossible reality where her own child had abandoned her on a deserted road like unwanted cargo. She had no phone. Alexander had taken it. No way to call for help. No idea where she was or how far from civilization. The rain continued to fall, and Victoria tilted her face up to it, letting it mix with her tears. In all her years, through all her struggles, she had never felt so utterly alone. Flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead and behind, showing nothing but empty darkness in either direction. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the sound of her son's final words, "Goodbye, Mother." Time became meaningless as Victoria sat there, her clothes and hair plastered to her skin, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair so tightly they hurt. She thought of all the times she had soothed Alexander's fears, bandaged his scraped knees, celebrated his victories. She thought of the day he got his first investment, how proud she had been. She thought of the subtle changes she had ignored. Over the years, the growing coldness, the increasing distance, the hardening of his heart. Another lightning flash, and this time Victoria caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A light. She squinted through the rain, trying to be sure she wasn't imagining it. Yes, there it was again, a warm, steady glow that had to be coming from a house or a farm. Victoria looked down at her wheels, already caked with mud from the road's shoulder. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible in these conditions. But she had no choice. She was alone now, truly alone, and her survival depended entirely on her own strength. With trembling hands, she gripped her wheels and began to push forward into the storm. Chapter 3. A Light in the Storm. Victoria's arms burned with exhaustion as she pushed her wheelchair through the muddy road. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her body like a second skin. The distant light she had spotted earlier seemed to flicker and dance, sometimes disappearing altogether behind the trees, only to reappear moments later, beckoning her forward like a promise. Her hands, soft from years of privilege, were raw and bleeding from gripping the wheels. Each push forward was a battle against the mud that threatened to swallow her wheels whole, but Victoria refused to give up. The image of Alexander's retreating car fueled something deep inside her. Not anger, not yet, but a determination she hadn't known she possessed. A sudden gust of wind sent a shiver through her body, and she realized she had lost feeling in her fingers. Hypothermia, she thought distantly, remembering a first aid course she had taken years ago. She needed to find shelter soon. The light grew stronger as she rounded a bend in the road. Through the gloom, she could make out the shape of a modest farmhouse, its windows glowing with warm yellow light. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and smoke curled from the chimney into the stormy sky. "Hello?" Victoria called out, her voice hoarse and barely carrying over the wind. "Please, is anyone there?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the front door opened, spilling more light onto the porch, and two figures emerged. They hurried down the steps, and Victoria felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Good Lord," a woman's voice called out. "Frank, help me get her inside." The figures resolved into an elderly couple as they drew closer. The woman had silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, while the man walked with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a cane. Despite his obvious difficulty, he moved quickly to Victoria's side. "I'm Eleanor Preston, and this is my husband Frank," the woman said, already checking Victoria for injuries. "You're frozen through. What in heaven's name are you doing out here in this weather?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The events of the evening crashed over her like a wave, and she began to shake uncontrollably. Eleanor wrapped a warm arm around her shoulders while Frank positioned himself behind the wheelchair. "Questions can wait," Frank said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's get you inside first." Together, they managed to navigate the wheelchair, up the ramp that ran alongside the porch steps. Victoria noted the ramp with curiosity. It seemed too well constructed to be temporary. Inside, the house was modest but immaculately kept, with comfortable furniture and walls lined with family photos. Eleanor disappeared briefly and returned with towels and dry clothes. "The bathroom's just down the hall, dear. It's fully accessible. Frank had it modified last year. Can you manage on your own, or do you need help?" I can manage," Victoria replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." In the bathroom, Victoria caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her carefully maintained hair was plastered to her head. Her expensive clothes were caked with mud, and her face was pale and drawn. But it was her eyes that gave her pause. They held a look she had never seen before, a mixture of pain and something else, something harder to define. When she emerged, dressed in Eleanor's borrowed clothes, she found the couple waiting in the living room. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and Eleanor pressed a mug of hot tea into her trembling hands. "Now then," Eleanor said, settling into an armchair while Frank lowered himself carefully onto the couch, "would you like to tell us what brought you to our door on such a night?" Victoria stared into her tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. How could she explain? How could she put into words that her own son, the child she had raised with all the love in her heart, had left her to face the elements alone? "I'm Victoria Matthews," she began, and saw recognition flicker in Eleanor's eyes. Everyone knew the Matthews name, after all. "And I was left here on the road." Frank's weathered face darkened. "Left? By whom?" "My son." The words felt like glass in her throat. "He decided I was a liability to his company." Silence fell in the warm room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. Victoria waited for the judgment, the disbelief, the awkward platitudes that usually followed any mention of family troubles. Instead, Eleanor reached out and took her hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're safe now," she said simply. And, in those 3 words, Victoria felt something inside her begin to thaw. Frank shifted in his seat, his cane tapping thoughtfully against the floor. "You'll stay with us, of course," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "The guest room is already set up for wheelchair access. Had it done when my sister visited last summer." Victoria looked between them, these strangers, who offered shelter and kindness without hesitation. "I couldn't impose—" "Nonsense," Eleanor cut her off gently. "We may not have your son's billions, but we have enough to share. And more importantly, we have each other." The simple declaration brought fresh tears to Victoria's eyes. She thought of her own sprawling mansion, filled with expensive furniture, but devoid of warmth. She thought of Alexander's cold efficiency, his calculation of her worth in terms of stock prices and public perception. "I should tell you," Victoria said, her hands tightening around the warm mug. "I was at the doctor's today before everything. I never got to hear what he had to say, but I suspect it wasn't good news." Eleanor and Frank exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared understanding. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said firmly, "we'll sort all that out. For tonight, you need rest." If on cue, Victoria felt exhaustion wash over her in a heavy wave. The events of the day, the physical strain, the emotional trauma, it all seemed to hit her at once. Eleanor showed her to the guest room, which was indeed perfectly adapted for her needs, right down to the grab bars by the bed. "Sleep well, dear," Eleanor said, pausing at the door. "Remember, you're not alone anymore." Lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the rain against the windows, Victoria felt something shift inside her. The pain was still there, raw and deep, but alongside it was something new, a tiny spark of resilience nurtured by the kindness of strangers who had become, in the space of a few hours, more like family than her own flesh and blood. Chapter 4. The news. The morning brought weak sunshine and the smell of coffee wafting through the Preston home. Victoria woke to find clean clothes laid out for her, simple, practical things that Eleanor must have purchased for her sister's visit. Her own mud-stained designer outfit had been washed and hung to dry, the labels bearing names that probably cost more than a month's expenses in this modest household. She wheeled herself to the kitchen where Eleanor was making breakfast, and Frank sat at the table reading a newspaper. The domesticity of the scene made her throat tight. How long had it been since she'd experienced a simple family breakfast? "Good morning, dear," Eleanor said, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. "Frank's already called Dr. Martinez at the clinic in town. She can see you this afternoon." Victoria's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. "A doctor? I should really go back to Dr. Henderson at St. Mary's. That's nearly 2 hours away," Frank interrupted, folding his newspaper. "And Dr. Martinez is excellent. She handled my hip replacement last year, and she has experience with spinal cord injuries." The kindness in their planning brought fresh tears to Victoria's eyes. These people who owed her nothing had already begun arranging for her care. "Thank you," she managed. "Both of you." Eleanor squeezed her shoulder as she passed. "Eat up now. You'll need your strength." The local clinic was smaller than St. Mary's, but immaculately maintained. Dr. Martinez, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence, reviewed Victoria's medical history with careful attention. "We'll need to run some tests to confirm," she said, studying the preliminary results from St. Mary's that Frank had somehow obtained. "But based on these indicators, I'm concerned about the possibility of a tumor." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Victoria felt Eleanor's hand slip into hers, grounding her to the moment. "How advanced?" Victoria asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "We'll know more after the full workup, but the initial signs suggest it's in an early stage. That's good news. It means we have options." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious, but not without hope. "The challenge will be managing treatment alongside your paraplegia. The combination of conditions will require careful coordination, but it's absolutely manageable with the right support system." Victoria thought of Alexander, of how he would have reacted to this news. Would he have seen it as just another liability? Another reason to distance himself from her. The thought no longer brought the sharp pain it had yesterday. Instead, she felt something else stirring in her chest. Determination. "What do we need to do first?" she asked. The rest of the appointment passed in a blur of scheduled tests, treatment options, and medication discussions. Through it all, Eleanor remained by her side, taking notes and asking practical questions that Victoria's shocked mind couldn't formulate. On the drive back to the Preston farm, Victoria watched the countryside roll past. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a landscape washed clean and bright. Fields stretched to the horizon, and here and there she could see farmers at work, their tractors moving in steady patterns across the land. "You know," Frank said from the driver's seat, his voice thoughtful, "when I had my accident, the one that left me with this bum leg, I thought my life was over. Farming was all I knew, and suddenly I couldn't do half the things I used to." Victoria turned from the window, caught by the echo of her own experience. In his words, "But Eleanor, she wouldn't let me give up. Got me into physical therapy, helped me figure out new ways to do things. We adapted the farm equipment, hired some help. And you know what? The farm's doing better now than it ever did before. Sometimes what we think is an ending turns out to be just a different kind of beginning." They pulled up to the house, where Eleanor had already started preparing lunch. As Frank helped Victoria with her wheelchair, she noticed things she had missed in the darkness last night. The carefully maintained gardens, the smooth paths between buildings, the subtle modifications that made the property accessible without sacrificing its charm. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said over lunch, "about your doctor's appointments and treatments. The guest room is yours for as long as you need it, of course, but we should probably get you some more clothes and personal items. And we'll need to coordinate with the medical center about transportation." "I can't accept all this," Victoria interrupted, overwhelmed by their generosity. "You've already done so much." Frank set down his fork with deliberate care. "Victoria, do you know why we have all these accessibility modifications? It's not just for my leg or for my sister's visits. Eleanor and we've been running a small support group for people with disabilities in the community. Nothing fancy, just a place where people can come together, share their experiences, help each other out. What Frank's trying to say, Eleanor added, is that helping others isn't a burden. It's what gives life meaning. We have the means and the experience to help you through this, and we want to. The only question is, will you let us? Victoria looked at these two people who had opened their home and their hearts to her without hesitation. She thought of the long road ahead, the treatments, the challenges, the uncertainty. But for the first time since the accident that took her mobility, since Alexander's betrayal, since the doctor's grave expression yesterday morning, she felt something like hope. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find herself smiling. "Yes, I will." Chapter 5. New Beginnings. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Victoria's life, unlike anything she had known before. Gone were the elaborate dinner parties and charity galas that had once filled her calendar. Instead, her days revolved around doctors' appointments, physical therapy sessions, and the simple routines of life at the Preston farm. Eleanor and Frank's support group met every Wednesday evening in the converted barn behind their house. At first, Victoria had hesitated to attend, unsure of her place among people who had lived with their conditions far longer than she had. But Eleanor had insisted, and on a cool autumn evening, Victoria found herself wheeling into the warmly lit space. "Everyone, this is Victoria," Eleanor announced to the small gathering. "She's staying with us for a while." Victoria scanned the faces before her, a teenage boy with prosthetic legs, an elderly woman with a walker, a middle-aged man in a wheelchair similar to her own. None of them showed the pity or awkward discomfort she had grown accustomed to in her old social circle. "Welcome to the family," the teenage boy said with a grin. "I'm Jason. Fair warning, Eleanor's going to try to stuff you with cookies. She thinks sugar fixes everything." "That's because it does," Eleanor retorted, producing a plate of chocolate chip cookies as if on cue. As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself drawn into conversations that felt more genuine than any she'd had in years. These people spoke openly about their challenges, sharing both frustrations and triumphs. They traded tips about adaptive equipment, discussed accessibility issues in the community, and laughed together about the absurd situations they sometimes found themselves in. "You know what the worst part is?" Sarah, the elderly woman, said during a discussion about public spaces. "It's not the physical barriers. It's the way some people look right through you, like you've stopped being a person just because you need help walking." Victoria thought of Alexander, of how he had looked at her after the accident. Not through her, but past her, as if she had become an inconvenient object rather than his mother. The memory still hurt, but here, surrounded by people who understood, the pain felt different somehow, less isolating. "I used to be embarrassed about asking for help," Jason shared. "Thought it made me weak or something. Then Frank here showed me that strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to lean on others." Frank, who had been quietly listening from his chair, tapped his cane on the floor for attention. "Speaking of leaning on others, I've got an announcement. The county's finally approved our proposal for the accessibility audit of public buildings. We'll need volunteers to help with the surveys." The news sparked excited discussion. Victoria listened as the group debated which buildings to prioritize, what specific issues to document, how to present their findings to the city council. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and she found herself raising her hand to volunteer before she'd even fully processed the decision. Later that night, as Eleanor served tea in the kitchen, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about the meeting. "They're so positive," she mused, "even with everything they're dealing with." "They're survivors," Eleanor replied, settling into her chair, "just like you." Victoria traced the rim of her teacup with a finger. "I don't feel much like a survivor. I feel—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I feel like I'm still waiting for my real life to resume, even though I know it never will." "Maybe that's because you're thinking about it wrong, Frank," said, joining them at the table. "You're not waiting for your old life to resume, you're building a new one. And from what I saw tonight, you're doing a pretty good job of it." The words struck Victoria with unexpected force. She thought of her life before, the endless social obligations, the careful maintenance of appearances, the constant effort to support Alexander's ambitions. Had that really been living, or had she just been going through the motions? Her chemotherapy was scheduled to begin the following week. The thought terrified her, but when she mentioned this to Dr. Martinez, the doctor had smiled and said something that stuck with her. "Fear is natural, but it doesn't have to be paralyzing. Sometimes it can be fuel." That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. She wheeled herself to the window, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns on the farm's fields. In the distance, she could see the lights of the small town where the medical center was located. Somewhere beyond that, Alexander was probably in his penthouse office, surrounded by the empire he had built, an empire that had cost him his humanity. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Victoria found herself making a wish, not for healing or for her son's return, but for something she had never thought to ask for before: purpose. The next morning, she asked Eleanor to help her set up a laptop. "I want to research accessibility laws," she explained. "If we're going to do these building surveys, we should know exactly what standards we're measuring against." Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "I'll do you one better. Linda from the group? She's a retired civil rights lawyer. I'm sure she'd be happy to share her expertise." And so began Victoria's education in a field she had never considered before. She threw herself into learning about the Americans with Disabilities Act, building codes, and advocacy strategies. Her business background, which she had mainly used to support Alexander's ventures, proved unexpectedly valuable in understanding the legal and regulatory frameworks. The work gave her something to focus on besides her upcoming treatment. Each evening, she would share what she had learned with Frank and Eleanor, who listened with genuine interest and offered insights from their years of community advocacy. "You know," Frank said one evening, "we've been trying to get the town to install proper ramps at the library for years, but maybe what we need is someone who knows how to speak the language of bureaucracy." Victoria smiled, remembering how she used to navigate the corporate world's complex social and political landscape. "Well," she said, "I might know a thing or two about that." Chapter 6. The First Test. The morning of Victoria's first chemotherapy session dawned clear and crisp. She had spent hours researching what to expect, but no amount of preparation could fully quell the anxiety churning in her stomach. Eleanor insisted on accompanying her, packing a bag with books, snacks, and a hand-knitted blanket. "The treatment center can get chilly," she explained, tucking the blanket around Victoria's legs. "And these things can take a while." The local medical center's oncology department was smaller than St. Mary's, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in warmth. Dr. Martinez was waiting for them, her presence reassuring as she explained each step of the procedure. "Remember," she said as the nurse prepared the IV, "everyone reacts differently. Some people feel fine afterward, others need more recovery time. Listen to your body and don't try to push too hard." Victoria nodded, her throat tight. She thought of all the times she had pushed through difficulty, raising Alexander alone, building their social status from nothing, maintaining a perfect image for the sake of his business. But this was different. This was a battle she couldn't win through sheer force of will. As the medication began flowing into her veins, Eleanor pulled out a folder filled with papers. "I thought we might use this time productively," she said. Linda dropped off some interesting case studies about successful accessibility initiatives in other towns. Victoria gratefully seized the distraction, and soon they were deep in discussion about legal precedents and community organizing strategies. The hours passed more quickly than she expected, and before she knew it, the session was complete. The aftermath hit her harder than she had anticipated. By the time they arrived home, exhaustion had settled into her bones like lead. Frank had prepared the guest room, now firmly established as Victoria's room, with extra pillows and a small bell to ring if she needed anything. "I feel useless," Victoria admitted as Eleanor helped her into bed. All these plans we've been making, and I can barely keep my eyes open. Healing isn't useless, Eleanor replied firmly. Rest now. The world's problems will still be there when you're stronger. The next few days passed in a blur of fatigue and nausea. Victoria drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes waking to find Eleanor quietly leaving fresh water or ginger tea by her bedside. During her more lucid moments, she could hear the normal sounds of farm life continuing outside. Tractors rumbling, chickens clucking, Frank's voice calling to the farmhands. On the third day, she felt strong enough to join them. For breakfast, as she wheeled into the kitchen, she found not only Frank and Eleanor but also Jason from the support group, his prosthetic legs propped casually against his chair as he devoured a stack of pancakes. "Look who's up," he exclaimed. "Perfect timing. We need your help with something." Victoria accepted a cup of coffee from Eleanor, raising an eyebrow at the teenager's enthusiasm. "Oh? The school board's trying to cut funding for adaptive physical education," Jason explained, his expression darkening. "They say it's too expensive to maintain separate equipment and programs for the handful of students who need them." The old Victoria would have written a check to cover the shortfall. It had been her standard response to most problems, throw money at them until they went away. But now, watching Jason's face as he described how the program had helped him regain confidence after his accident, she felt a different kind of response forming. "Tell me more about the school board," she said, reaching for the notepad she had taken to keeping nearby. "When do they meet? Who are the key decision makers?" Over the next hour, they mapped out the situation. Jason provided inside information about the school's dynamics, while Frank contributed his knowledge of local politics. Victoria found herself drawing on years of experience in navigating bureaucratic systems, breaking down the challenge into manageable pieces. "The key," she explained, "isn't just to fight the budget cut. We need to demonstrate the program's value in terms they'll understand, cost-benefit analysis, long-term impact studies, parent testimonials, build a case they can't ignore." "Like a business proposal?" Jason asked. "Exactly like that." Victoria smiled, remembering countless boardroom presentations. "But instead of profit margins, we're selling something far more valuable: opportunity." Eleanor watched this exchange with knowing eyes. "Sounds like you might need your laptop after all," she said, "if you're feeling up to it." Victoria considered her body's signals, the lingering fatigue, the slight nausea. But there was something else too, a sense of purpose that seemed to energize her despite her physical limitations. "I think I am," she said. "Jason, can you get me enrollment numbers for the program? And Frank, we'll need data on similar programs in other districts." As they scattered to gather information, Victoria felt a subtle shift in her perspective. Yes, her body was fighting battles on multiple fronts: the paraplegia, the cancer, the after effects of treatment. But her mind was as sharp as ever, and perhaps even sharper now that she had a cause that truly mattered. She thought of Alexander, of how he measured everything in terms of profit and loss. What would he make of this, his mother, fresh from chemotherapy, helping a teenager fight for a school program that affected maybe a dozen students? He would probably call it a waste of resources, a poor investment of time and energy. But as Victoria began outlining their strategy, she realized something profound. She had never felt more invested in anything in her life. This wasn't about maintaining appearances or building a business empire. This was about making a real difference in people's lives, no matter how small the scale might seem. "You know," Frank said, returning with a stack of reports, "I haven't seen you this fired up since you started staying with us." Victoria looked up from her notes, surprised to find that her fatigue had receded to a manageable background hum. "I guess I needed something to fight for," she replied, "something bigger than myself." "That's the best medicine there is," Eleanor said, setting a fresh cup of tea beside her. "Now let's show that school board what happens when they mess with our kids." Chapter 7. Ripples of Change. The school board meeting room was packed to capacity. Victoria sat in her wheelchair near the front, Jason beside her, both of them armed with carefully prepared presentations. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, conducted between her chemotherapy sessions and rest periods. Are you nervous?" Jason whispered as the board members filed in. Victoria smoothed the folder in her lap, containing meticulously researched statistics and testimonials. "Actually, no," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. After years of high-stakes business negotiations, this felt different, purer somehow. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but when the topic of adaptive physical education came up, Victoria noticed the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Their discomfort only increased when they saw the size of the crowd gathered to speak on the issue. Victoria wheeled herself to the podium when her name was called. Looking out at the faces before her, she drew on decades of experience in commanding attention in boardrooms and social gatherings. But this time, instead of promoting business interests or social status, she was fighting for something that mattered. "Distinguished board members," she began, her voice clear and strong, "you have before you a proposal to cut funding for adaptive physical education. On paper, this may seem like a logical budget decision, but I'm here to show you why it would be a costly mistake, not just morally, but financially." For the next 10 minutes, she presented her case with precision and passion. She showed studies linking adaptive physical education to improved academic performance and reduced healthcare costs. She presented letters from medical professionals about the program's impact on rehabilitation. But her masterstroke came when she introduced the human element. "I'd like you to meet Jason Thompson," she said, gesturing to the teenager who wheeled her away from the podium before taking her place. "He's going to show you exactly what this program means to our community." Jason's speech was less polished than Victoria's, but its raw honesty captivated the room. He spoke about the isolation he felt after losing his legs, how the adaptive PE program had given him back his sense of belonging. He demonstrated some of the specialized equipment, showing how it allowed students with various disabilities to participate fully in school activities. "This isn't just about sports," he concluded. "It's about giving kids like me a chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about?" The board's decision was unanimous. Not only would the program keep its funding, but they would explore ways to expand it to other schools in the district. As the crowd dispersed, celebrating their victory, Victoria found herself surrounded by parents and students, all eager to share their stories and gratitude. "That was incredible," Eleanor said later that evening as they sat around the Prestons' kitchen table. "You two made quite a team." Jason grinned, helping himself to another of Eleanor's victory cookies. "Did you see their faces when Mrs. Matthews started talking about cost-benefit analysis? I thought the treasurer was going to fall out of his chair." Victoria smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead to other possibilities. During her research, she had discovered numerous gaps in accessibility throughout the community, not just in schools but in public buildings, parks, and businesses. The school board victory was just the beginning. "We need to think bigger," she said, pulling out her notebook. "The support group has been trying to effect change piece by piece, but what if we took a more comprehensive approach?" Frank leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "A foundation," Victoria replied, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "Something to coordinate accessibility initiatives across the county. We could pool resources, share expertise, create a unified voice for advocacy." Eleanor and Frank exchanged glances. "That's quite an undertaking," Eleanor said carefully, "especially while you're undergoing treatment." Victoria acknowledged the concern with a nod. Her latest round of chemotherapy had left her exhausted, and she knew there would be more challenging days ahead, but she also felt more alive than she had in years. "I won't pretend it will be easy," she said, "but I've spent my life helping build one man's empire. Maybe it's time to build something that helps many people instead." "Count me in," Jason declared. "We could call it the Breaking Barriers Foundation or something cool like that." The conversation flowed late into the evening as they brainstormed possibilities. Victoria drew on her business experience to outline organizational structures and funding strategies, while Frank and Eleanor contributed their deep knowledge of community needs. Even Dr. Martinez, who stopped by to check on Victoria, got pulled into the discussion. offering valuable insights about healthcare accessibility. Later that night, unable to sleep, Victoria wheeled herself to her favorite spot by the window. The moon was full, casting silver light across the farm's fields. In the distance, she could see the town's lights twinkling like earthbound stars. She thought about how much her life had changed since that rainy night when Alexander had abandoned her. The pain of his betrayal was still there, a dull ache in her heart, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she found herself focused on the future, not just her own, but the future she could help create for others. Her laptop sat open on the desk, displaying news headlines about Matthews Industries' latest acquisition. Alexander's face stared out from the screen, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. Victoria closed the laptop gently, turning instead to the notebook where she had begun sketching out plans for the foundation. "Your empire is built on profit," she whispered to her son's memory. "Mine will be built on purpose." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and this time Victoria didn't make a wish. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly what she wanted to do with whatever time she had left. The cancer might be waging war in her body, and her legs might never work again, but her spirit had never been stronger. Tomorrow would bring another chemotherapy session, another battle against fatigue and nausea. But it would also bring opportunities to make a difference, to turn her own struggles into stepping stones for others. And somehow, that made everything else more bearable. Chapter 8. Seeds of Hope. The Breaking Barriers Foundation took shape, faster than anyone had anticipated. Victoria's years of networking and organizational experience, combined with the Prestons' deep community connections, proved to be a powerful combination. Within weeks, they had secured a small office space in town, complete with wheelchair accessibility and adaptive technology. "It's not exactly Matthews Industries headquarters," Frank commented as they toured the modest space, "but it's a start." Victoria ran her hand along the smooth surface of the reception desk. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The space might be small, but it was filled with possibility rather than pretense. Linda, the retired civil rights lawyer from the support group, had agreed to serve as their legal advisor. She sat across from Victoria now, reviewing their incorporation papers with a practiced eye. "You've done an impressive job with the organizational structure," she said, making a few notes. "But have you considered who's going to handle the day-to-day operations? Running a foundation isn't easy, especially with your health challenges." Victoria gestured to the young woman arranging files in the corner. Sarah, a recent college graduate who used a wheelchair herself, had volunteered to be their first employee. "We're starting small, but purposefully. Each person we bring on board will understand our mission because they've lived it." The Foundation's first major initiative was a comprehensive accessibility survey of the town. Teams of volunteers, led by support group members, documented every curb, ramp, doorway, and public space. Victoria coordinated the effort from their new office, using her chemotherapy sessions as impromptu meeting times. "You should be resting," Dr. Martinez scolded gently during one treatment, even as she looked over the preliminary survey results. With interest. "This is better than rest," Victoria replied, marking another intersection that needed attention. "This gives me a reason to keep fighting." And fight she did, through waves of nausea and fatigue, through days when her hands shook, too much to wheel herself, through nights when pain kept her awake. The foundation became her anchor, giving purpose to her struggles. One morning, as Victoria reviewed grant applications at her desk, she heard a commotion in the reception area. A woman's voice, tight with frustration, cut through the usual quiet of the office. "I don't know where else to turn," the woman was saying. "The insurance company won't cover the modifications, and without them, Emily can't even get into our own bathroom." Victoria wheeled herself to the door of her office. The woman looked up, and Victoria saw the desperation in her eyes, the same desperation she had felt when facing her own challenges. "Please come in," Victoria said, gesturing to the comfortable seating area she had specifically designed for such conversations. "Tell me about Emily." For the next hour, she listened as Karen Davis shared her story. Her daughter Emily, a bright 12-year-old, had recently been diagnosed with a progressive muscular condition. Their insurance would cover medical treatments, but not the home modifications needed to accommodate her changing mobility needs. The contractor estimates it will cost at least $15,000, Karen concluded, twisting a tissue in her hands. We've already spent our savings on medical bills. Victoria thought of the millions she had once spent on luxury cars and vacation homes. Let me make some calls, she said, already reaching for her phone. By the end of the day, she had assembled a team of volunteers, contractors from the support group, architecture students from the local college, and community members willing to donate time and materials. The Breaking Barriers Foundation would coordinate the effort and provide seed funding. We're not just modifying one bathroom, Victoria explained to her board members. We're creating a template for future projects. Every home we adapt teaches us something new about accessible design. The Davis home renovation became a community event. Over several weekends, volunteers transformed not just the bathroom but the entire first floor into an accessible space. Emily, watching from her wheelchair, offered suggestions and encouragement to the workers. "Look, Mom," she called out during the final stages. "I can reach everything in my room now." Victoria watched from the sidelines as Emily explored her newly accessible space, her face glowing with independence and joy. The sight made every struggle, every setback, every exhausted evening worth it. That night, back at the Preston farm, Victoria sat at her laptop reviewing photos of the renovation. Eleanor brought her a cup of tea and settled into the chair beside her. "You've started something remarkable," Eleanor said, looking at the images of smiling volunteers and the transformed Davis home. "People are starting to see disability rights differently, not as charity but as a community responsibility." Victoria nodded, thinking of how her own perspective had shifted since the accident. "You know what the strange thing is? I used to think success meant having more money, more status, more power. But now you measure it differently," Eleanor finished for her. "Yes," Victoria agreed. "Now I measure it in moments like today, in lives changed, in barriers broken." She opened her email to find dozens of messages from community members inspired by the Davis Project, offering to volunteer for future renovations. Among them was a message from a local news reporter requesting an interview about the foundation's work. "They want to do a feature story," Victoria told Eleanor, scanning the email, "about how a small-town foundation is transforming lives one project at a time." Eleanor squeezed her shoulder. "Are you ready for that kind of attention?" Victoria thought about Alexander, about the possibility that news of her work might reach him. For a moment, she felt a flutter of anxiety. Then she looked back at the photos from the Davis home, at Emily's radiant smile, at the volunteers working together to make a difference. "Yes," she said firmly. "It's time to show the world that true success isn't built on stepping over people. It's built on lifting them up." Chapter 9. Growing Recognition. The local news feature about the Breaking Barriers Foundation aired on a quiet Tuesday evening. Victoria watched it from the Prestons' living room, surrounded by her newfound family and members of the support group. The reporter had done an excellent job capturing the spirit of their work, weaving together stories of community transformation with intimate portraits of the lives they touched. The foundation, led by former socialite Victoria Matthews, has revolutionized how this small town thinks about accessibility, the reporter's voice narrated over footage of the Davis home. Renovation. But perhaps more remarkable than the physical changes are the emotional ones. The camera cut to Emily Davis, demonstrating how she could now navigate her home independently. "It's not just about the ramps and rails," the young girl said, her eyes bright with confidence. "It's about feeling like I belong, like I'm not a problem to be solved." Jason let out a whoop from his spot on the couch. "Did you see that? We're famous." Victoria smiled at his enthusiasm, but her mind was already racing ahead. The story had turned out better than she'd hoped, highlighting not just their achievements, but the systemic changes they were advocating for. It was exactly the kind of exposure they needed to expand their impact. She wasn't prepared for what happened next. The morning after the broadcast, their small office was flooded with calls and emails. Other communities wanted to know how they could replicate their programs. Families reached out seeking help. Local businesses inquired about making their spaces more accessible. "We're going to need more volunteers," Sarah announced, wheeling herself into Victoria's office with a stack of messages. "And probably more space." Victoria was about to respond when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was from the state capital. "Mrs. Matthews?" a professional voice inquired when she answered. "This is Representative Claire Wilson's office. The representative was very impressed by your foundation's work. She's developing legislation about accessibility standards, and she'd like to meet with you to discuss your experiences." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Despite her ongoing chemotherapy treatments, leaving her more tired than usual, Victoria threw herself into preparation. She compiled data from their projects, gathered testimonials, and worked with Linda to draft policy recommendations. "You should rest," Eleanor urged, finding Victoria up late one night surrounded by papers. "I'll rest when we've made a difference," Victoria replied, though she did allow Eleanor to wrap a warm blanket around her shoulders. The day of the meeting arrived bright and clear. Representative Wilson turned out to be a sharp-minded woman in her 50s who listened intently as Victoria presented their findings. "What strikes me," the representative said, "is how you've made this a community effort. This isn't just about government mandates, it's about changing hearts and minds." "Exactly," Victoria agreed. "When people understand that accessibility benefits everyone, they stop seeing it as a burden and start seeing it as an investment in their community." The meeting ran long, with Wilson's staff taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions. By the end, the representative had invited Victoria to testify at an upcoming legislative committee hearing. "Your perspective would be invaluable," Wilson said, "both as someone who has experienced these challenges personally and as someone who's found innovative solutions." On the drive back to the Preston farm, Victoria's mind was racing with possibilities. State-level legislation could amplify their impact exponentially, but more than that, it would send a message that accessibility wasn't a luxury, it was a right. Frank was waiting on the porch when they returned. "How'd it go?" "Better than we could have hoped," Victoria replied, letting him help her up the ramp. "But I need to ask you and Eleanor something important." Over dinner, Victoria laid out her ideas. The committee hearing would be an opportunity to push for real change, but it would also mean more public exposure. Her story, including Alexander's actions, might come to light. "Are you ready for that?" Eleanor asked gently. Victoria looked around the kitchen that had become more home to her than any mansion ever had. "I think I am. My shame about what happened, it's gone. Alexander's actions reflect on him, not me, and if sharing my story helps others, then it's worth it." Later that evening, as Victoria prepared for bed, she noticed a small article in the business section of the state newspaper. Matthews Industries' stock had dropped significantly following a failed merger attempt. The photo showed Alexander looking uncharacteristically stressed, his usual confident smirk replaced by a tight-lipped frown. For the first time, Victoria looked at her son's image without feeling that sharp pain in her chest. Instead, she felt something closer to pity. He had everything money could buy, but he'd lost something far more precious, his humanity. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "Check out our foundation's social media. The video of Emily's story has gone viral." Victoria opened the link to find thousands of shares and comments. People from across the country were reaching out, sharing their own accessibility challenges and dreams of independence. What had started as a small-town initiative was becoming a movement. The chemotherapy had taken its toll on her body. Her hair was thinner, her face more lined, her energy limited. But as Victoria read comment after comment from people inspired by their work, she felt stronger than ever. "Your empire's built on numbers," she whispered to Alexander's troubled image in the newspaper. "Mine's built on hope." She turned off the light and wheeled herself to the window. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. Somewhere out there, her son was probably in his penthouse office, surrounded by the trappings of success but utterly alone. Meanwhile, here she was in a modest farmhouse surrounded by love and purpose. The irony wasn't lost on her. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Past. The legislative hearing was scheduled for early spring, just as the first daffodils were pushing through the soil in Eleanor's garden. Victoria's testimony was prepared, reviewed and polished until every word carried exactly the weight she intended. But it wasn't just words she was bringing to the state capitol. It was stories, faces, and transformed lives. The morning of the hearing, Victoria sat in her bathroom studying her reflection as Eleanor helped her prepare. The chemotherapy had taken most of her hair, but she had decided against wearing a wig. Her bare head and the lines of experience on her face told a story of survival and transformation that no designer outfit could match. "You look beautiful," Eleanor said, adjusting Victoria's collar. "Strong." The hearing room was packed when they arrived. Victoria recognized faces from their foundation's network: Jason and his parents, the Davis family, Linda, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by their work. But there were also unfamiliar faces, people who had traveled from across the state to support the legislation. Representative Wilson welcomed Victoria warmly. "Are you ready?" Victoria nodded, wheeling herself to the designated space. The cameras from various news outlets tracked her movement, and she could feel the weight of expectation in the room. But unlike the countless society galas and charity functions she had attended in her previous life, this spotlight felt right. "My name is Victoria Matthews," she began, her voice clear and steady. "A year ago, I was abandoned on a deserted road because my disability made me inconvenient. Today, I'm here to ensure that no one else is ever treated as disposable." She felt the room's attention sharpen at her words. This part of her story hadn't been public before, and she knew the Matthews name carried weight in these circles, but she pressed on, not dwelling on the personal tragedy, but using it to illuminate a larger truth. "What happened to me was extreme, but it reflects an attitude that many disabled people face daily: the idea that our needs are too costly, too complicated, too inconvenient. Through our foundation's work, we've proven that the opposite is true. When communities invest in accessibility, everyone benefits." For the next 20 minutes, Victoria presented their findings. She showed how their home modification program had allowed elderly residents to age in place, reducing healthcare costs. She demonstrated how accessible businesses had increased their customer base and improved their bottom line. She shared stories of children like Emily, whose lives had been transformed by seemingly simple changes. But perhaps most importantly, she concluded, we've shown that disability rights aren't just about ramps and railings. They're about recognizing the inherent dignity and potential in every human being. The cost of exclusion, in talent lost, in dreams deferred, in human potential wasted, is far greater than the cost of inclusion. The questions from the committee members were thoughtful and engaged. Victoria handled them with the same skill she had once used in corporate boardrooms, but now her persuasion was powered by passion rather than profit. What she didn't notice, too focused on her testimony, was the junior aide who slipped out of the room partway through, making an urgent phone call to a major business publication. After the hearing, there was a small reception in a nearby conference room. Victoria found herself surrounded by people wanting to share their stories or offer support for the foundation's work. Representative Wilson introduced her to other legislators interested in sponsoring similar bills in their states. "You've started something significant," Wilson said. "This could be the beginning of real change." Victoria was about to respond when she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Sarah, her face tense with concern. "You need to see this," she said, holding out her phone. The business news website displayed a breaking headline: "Matthews Industries CEO's Dark Secret. Mother Claims Abandonment." Below was a photo of Victoria from the hearing, alongside Alexander's corporate headshot. The contrast between them was striking, her authentic, weathered strength against his polished, artificial perfection. Victoria felt her heart rate quicken, but not from fear. She had known this moment might come, had prepared for it. What she hadn't expected was the surge of pity she felt looking at her son's image. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked quietly. Victoria handed the phone back to Sarah. "Yes," she said, and meant it. Let him see exactly what I've built from the ashes of what he destroyed." Later that night, back at the Preston farm, Victoria received an email from Linda. The story had been picked up by major news outlets, and interview requests were pouring in. The Foundation's website had crashed from the sudden traffic surge. "We should craft a formal statement," Linda advised. "This attention could be a powerful platform for our cause." Victoria wheeled herself to her favorite spot by the window. The spring evening was soft with promise, the air fragrant with Eleanor's blooming flowers. She thought of how far she had come from that rainy night when Alexander had left her alone in the darkness. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jason. "You were amazing today. BTW, my mom says Matthews Industries stock is down 15% since the story broke. Karma's real." Victoria didn't take pleasure in the news of Alexander's business troubles. Instead, she felt a strange sense of clarity. All those years she had spent supporting his empire, she had thought she was helping him succeed. But perhaps she had actually been enabling him to fail in the ways that mattered most. She opened her laptop and began composing their official statement. It wouldn't mention Alexander by name or dwell on the past. Instead, it would focus on the future they were building, a future where no one would be left behind because they were deemed inconvenient. The cursor blinked on her screen as she typed, "The Breaking Barriers Foundation reaffirms its commitment to creating communities where every person's dignity and potential are recognized and valued." Recent media attention has highlighted the personal story behind our mission, but the true story is not about one person's choices. It's about thousands of people choosing to make a difference. Chapter 11. Ripples in the Empire. Alexander Matthews stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city lights flicker in the gathering dusk. On his desk, multiple screens displayed news coverage of his mother's testimony, social media reactions, and the plummeting stock prices of Matthews Industries. "Sir," his assistant's voice came through the intercom, "the board is requesting an emergency meeting." Alexander's reflection in the glass showed a man he barely recognized. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. The past week since Victoria's testimony had shaken his carefully constructed world to its foundation. "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes, he replied, straightening his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. The boardroom held the same faces that had once nodded approvingly at his decision to streamline family obligations. Now those faces wore expressions of concern and barely concealed judgment. The chairman, Bernard Wells, stood as Alexander entered. "This is a crisis of unprecedented proportions," Wells began without preamble. "Our major partners are distancing themselves. 3 charitable foundations have withdrawn their support. The public reaction is intense." Alexander maintained his composure as graphs and statistics were presented, each one showing the impact of the scandal on their bottom line. But inside, something was shifting, like tectonic plates grinding beneath a seemingly solid surface. "Your mother," one board member said, her voice sharp with accusation, "is becoming a symbol for disability rights advocates nationwide. The contrast between her foundation's work and our recent cost-cutting measures is unfortunate." Alexander remembered the last time he had seen Victoria, in his rearview mirror, growing smaller until she disappeared into the rain and darkness. He had told himself it was a necessary business decision. Now, watching clips of her testimony play on the boardroom screen, he saw something he had missed before. Not weakness, but extraordinary strength. "We need to get ahead of this," Wells continued. "Our PR team suggests a substantial donation to disability causes." "No," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself as much as the board. "Money won't fix this." Back in his office, Alexander dismissed his assistant and pulled up the full video of Victoria's testimony. He watched as she spoke not of him or his betrayal, but of hope and transformation. Her wheelchair was visible, but not central to her presence. Her bare head spoke of battles being fought, but not defining her. His phone buzzed with a message from James, his longtime chauffeur. "I've carried this guilt for too long. I should have refused to drive that night. I'm sorry, but I've submitted. My resignation." Another loss. How many had there been? Alexander tried to remember the last time someone had looked at him with genuine warmth rather than fear or calculation. Had it been his mother, even after he had started pushing her away? A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Patricia Chen, his chief financial officer, and one of the few people who still spoke to him with complete honesty. "The numbers aren't the real problem," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "We're losing something more valuable than money, trust." Alexander thought of all the decisions that had led to this moment. Each one had seemed logical, necessary for the growth of his empire. But looking back, he could see how each choice had stripped away a piece of his humanity. "I've been watching the coverage of your mother's foundation," Patricia continued. "Do you know what strikes me? They're doing more with a shoestring budget than we do with billions. They're changing lives while we're just changing profit margins." Through his window, Alexander could see the building where he had first started his company. Back then, he had dreamed of creating something meaningful, not just profitable. When had that vision become corrupted? His computer chimed with another news alert. Breaking Barriers Foundation announces expansion to 5 new states. Victoria Matthews calls for nationwide accessibility initiative. The photo accompanying the article showed his mother surrounded by people whose lives she had touched. A teenage boy with prosthetic legs, a young girl in a wheelchair beaming with newfound confidence, elderly couples who could now age in place thanks to home modifications. Alexander opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph he kept hidden beneath contracts and reports. It showed a much younger Victoria holding him at his college graduation, both of them smiling with genuine joy. He couldn't remember the last time he had smiled like that. "Patricia," he said, still looking at the photo, "clear my schedule for the next week and find out where my mother is staying." "What are you planning?" Alexander carefully placed the photograph on his desk, next to his latest quarterly report. The contrast was stark, paper profits versus real human connection. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I need to see what she's built. I need to understand what I destroyed." As Patricia left his office, Alexander turned back to the window. The city stretched before him, full of buildings he could buy but empty of the connections that truly mattered. Somewhere out there, his mother was creating something authentic and meaningful from the wreckage he had left behind. The empire he had sacrificed everything to build suddenly felt hollow, its gleaming surface masking a profound emptiness at its core. The question was, what could he build from his own wreckage? Chapter 12. Unexpected Visitor. The Breaking Barriers Foundation's new office space was buzzing with activity. The media attention following Victoria's testimony had brought an influx of support, volunteers, and requests for assistance. Victoria sat in her adapted workspace, reviewing proposals for their expansion program while trying to ignore the fatigue from her latest treatment. "Mrs. Matthews." Sarah appeared in her doorway looking unusually nervous. "There's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but..." Victoria looked up, ready to explain that they needed to follow their scheduling protocols. But Sarah's expression made her pause. "Who is it?" "Alexander Matthews." The name hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Victoria felt her heart skip a beat, but her hands remained steady on her wheelchair's arms. "Where is he?" "In the reception area." "Should I ask him to leave?" Victoria thought of the scared young man she had glimpsed in the news coverage, so different from the cold executive who had abandoned her. "No," she said after a moment. "Send him in." She wheeled herself to the window, positioning her chair so she could see her son's reflection when he entered. The door opened, and there he was, Alexander Matthews, billionaire CEO, standing. awkwardly in the doorway of a small-town non-profit office. "Mother," he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Victoria turned her chair to face him fully. He looked thinner than she remembered, the perfectly tailored suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. "Hello, Alexander. Please, sit down." He settled into one of the visitor chairs, his eyes taking in the modest office with its accessibility, modifications and walls covered in photos of community projects. His gaze lingered on a recent picture of Victoria with the Davis family, all of them laughing during their home's renovation celebration. "Your work," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I've been researching what you've accomplished here." "Have you?" Victoria kept her voice neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "And what have you learned?" "That you've helped more people in 1 year than I have in my entire career." The admission seemed to cost him something, but he pressed on. "The Foundation's impact analysis reports are impressive. You're changing lives, creating sustainable solutions, building real value." Victoria heard the business terms he fell back on, his attempt to quantify human dignity in familiar metrics. "That's not why we do it," she said quietly. "I know." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded her painfully of his childhood. "That's what I'm trying to understand. You have almost no resources compared to Matthews Industries, but you're making a real difference." "How?" "Because we measure success differently." Victoria wheeled closer to her desk, pulling out a folder. "This is Emily Davis's story, not the statistics or the cost analysis, but her journey. Would you like to read it?" Alexander took the folder with careful hands, as if it might burn him. He read in silence, his face gradually losing its corporate mask as Emily's words sank in. The story of a young girl regaining her independence, of a family finding hope, of a community coming together. It was so different from quarterly reports and profit margins. "There are hundreds more stories like hers," Victoria said. "Each one is about more than just accessibility. It's about dignity, about belonging, about seeing people as valuable simply because they are people." "I forgot that," Alexander whispered, still looking at Emily's photo. "Somewhere along the way I forgot that success could mean something other than stock prices and market share." Victoria watched her son, this stranger who wore her child's face, as he struggled with realizations that were shaking his worldview. "Why are you here, Alexander?" He looked up, and for the first time in years she saw real emotion in his eyes. "The board wants me to make a large donation to your foundation, a PR move to counter the bad press. But that's not why I came." "Then why?" "Because I need to understand what I lost, what I threw away." His voice cracked slightly. "The night I left you on that road, I thought I was protecting my empire. But I think I lost my soul instead." Victoria felt an old pain stir in her chest, but it was different now. Not the sharp agony of betrayal, but a deeper ache for all the years and love lost to ambition. "And now?" "Now?" Alexander stood, walking to the window where he could see volunteers unloading supplies for their next renovation project. "Now I don't know who I am anymore. The empire I built feels meaningless. The success I chased feels empty." "That's a beginning," Victoria said softly. "Recognizing what's missing is the first step to finding it again." Alexander turned back to her, and she saw tears in his eyes, something she hadn't seen since he was a child. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't deserve it. But I need to know. Is there a way to rebuild? Not the empire, but everything else I destroyed." Victoria thought of her own journey, of how she had rebuilt herself from the broken woman in the rain into someone stronger, someone who helped others find their strength. "Rebuilding takes time," she said, "and it requires more than words or money. It requires real change, real work." "Teach me," Alexander said, and for the first time in years, she heard genuine humility in his voice. "Show me how to build something that matters." Victoria looked at her son, seeing both the man he had become and the boy he had once been. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Trust once broken couldn't be mended with a single conversation. But as she gazed at the photos on her wall, at the lives transformed and communities strengthened, she knew something about the power of transformation. "Pull up a chair," she said finally. "I'll show you our current project. It's a family who needs their home modified for their daughter. No profit margins, no stock options, just people helping people." As Alexander sat down beside her desk, Victoria felt something shift in the room. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first seeds of possibility taking root in the ruins of what had been destroyed. Chapter 13. First Steps. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Alexander Matthews, dressed in jeans and a work shirt instead of his usual designer suit, stood awkwardly holding a paintbrush. Around him, volunteers from the Breaking Barriers Foundation worked efficiently, transforming the Thompson family's home into an accessible space for their elderly grandmother. "You're holding it wrong," Jason said, wheeling up beside him. The teenager had appointed himself Alexander's unofficial mentor in all things foundation-related, apparently unimpressed by his corporate credentials. "Here, like this." Alexander adjusted his grip, watching as Jason demonstrated the proper technique. It struck him how naturally the boy handled his wheelchair, how his disability seemed incidental to his confidence and capability. It was a stark contrast to how Alexander had viewed his mother's condition, as a weakness to be eliminated rather than a challenge to be adapted to. "Mrs. Thompson likes blue," Jason continued, gesturing to the wall they were painting. "She said it reminds her of the ocean where she used to take her grandkids swimming." Personal details like these would never have mattered in Alexander's corporate world. There, people were reduced to numbers on spreadsheets, problems to be solved with ruthless efficiency. But here, every project was about individual stories, about understanding the human impact of their work. Victoria arrived mid-morning, looking tired but determined after her latest treatment. Alexander watched as volunteers naturally adjusted their positions to make space for her wheelchair, their movements fluid and respectful. There was no pity in their interactions, only collaboration and mutual support. "How's it going?" she asked, stopping beside him. "I'm learning that I'm not as skilled at manual labor as I am at corporate takeovers," Alexander admitted, showing her the somewhat uneven paint job. "Humility looks good on you," she said with a small smile. "Come with me for a moment. There's something I want you to see." She led him to where Mrs. Thompson sat in her kitchen, watching the renovation through her window. The elderly woman's eyes lit up as Victoria entered, wheelchair easily navigating the newly widened doorway. "Victoria, dear. And this must be your son I've heard about." Alexander tensed, waiting for the judgment, the accusation. Everyone knew his story now, knew what he had done, but Mrs. Thompson simply patted the chair beside her. "Sit, sit. I was just telling Victoria how this reminds me of when my late husband modified our first home. He wasn't much of a handyman either, but he learned. Love makes you learn all sorts of things." As Mrs. Thompson shared stories of her life, Alexander found himself drawn into a world where success was measured in moments of connection rather than financial transactions. He learned about her grandchildren, her fears about losing independence as she aged, her dreams of still being able to bake cookies with her great-grandchildren in a kitchen she could safely navigate. "You know," she said, fixing Alexander with a knowing look, "sometimes we have to lose our way before we can find the right path." Later, as they took a break for lunch, Alexander watched the volunteers sharing sandwiches and stories on the front lawn. Frank Preston had arrived, with Eleanor, both of them easily joining the group's natural camaraderie. "It's different from board meetings, isn't it?" Victoria said, wheeling up beside him. "Everything about this is different," Alexander replied. "In my world, efficiency means eliminating variables. Here it's about embracing them, working with them. Because people aren't variables, Alex. They're stories waiting to be heard, lives waiting to be transformed." Alexander thought about his own story, about the path that had led him from a loving son to a cold-hearted CEO. "I've been thinking about Matthews Industries," he said carefully, "about its resources, its potential for impact." Victoria waited, letting him find the words. The board wants to distance themselves from me after everything. They're probably right. But before I step down, I want to redirect some of our R&D budget. There's no reason we can't develop affordable, accessible technology, create innovations that help people instead of just generating profit. That would be a significant change, Victoria observed. Everything's already changed, Alexander said, watching Jason teach a group of young volunteers how to properly install grab bars. I just didn't see it until now. The afternoon brought new tasks and challenges. Alexander found himself working alongside people whose lives had been directly impacted by accessibility issues. Each person had a story, a perspective that would never have reached his penthouse office. Sarah, who had initially regarded him with understandable suspicion, shared her experiences navigating college campuses in a wheelchair. The physical barriers were tough, she said, but the attitudinal ones were worse. People assuming what I couldn't do instead of asking what I could. As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson insisted on serving everyone coffee and cookies in her partially renovated kitchen. Alexander watched as she navigated the modified space with growing confidence, her joy in simple movements he had always taken for granted, evident in her face. "Tomorrow we'll finish the bathroom," Frank announced, reviewing their progress. "Alexander, think you can handle tiling?" The question was casual, assuming his continued participation without ceremony or special treatment. Alexander looked at his mother, saw the quiet observation in her eyes. "I'll probably make mistakes," he admitted. "We all do," Frank replied. "That's how we learn." As they cleaned up for the day, Alexander found himself looking at his reflection in a window. His clothes were paint-stained, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his manicured hands slightly scraped from work. But something in his eyes had changed, a softening around the edges, a glimpse of the person he might have been if he hadn't let ambition corrupt his soul. Victoria caught his gaze in the reflection. "One day at a time," she said softly. "That's how we rebuild." Chapter 14, Seeds of Change. 2 weeks after the Thompson house renovation, Victoria sat in Dr. Martinez's office, receiving her latest round of test results. The doctor's expression was cautiously optimistic as she reviewed the scans. "The treatment is showing positive results," she said. "The tumor has decreased in size. However, we need to continue the aggressive approach. Your body's response will determine our next steps." Victoria nodded, her mind already shifting to the Foundation's upcoming projects. "How long until I can return to full activity?" "You need to pace yourself," Dr. Martinez cautioned. "Your determination is admirable, but your body needs rest to heal." As if on cue, Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. Over the past weeks, he had thrown himself into the Foundation's work with an intensity that surprised everyone. But unlike his corporate drive for success at any cost, this energy was focused on understanding, learning, and genuine connection. "Board meeting finished. They accepted my resignation. Meeting you at the office to discuss new accessibility. Technology initiative?" Victoria smiled at the question mark. Such a small thing but significant from someone who had once only issued commands. "Progress comes in many forms," she murmured. "What was that?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Just thinking about healing. Not just physical healing, but the other kinds too." The doctor's eyes softened with understanding. Everyone in town knew about Alexander's return and his efforts to make amends. It had become something of a local story of redemption, though Victoria knew the reality was more complex than any simple narrative could capture. At the Foundation's office, she found Alexander in an intense discussion with Jason about wheelchair design. Sketches and technical specifications covered the conference room table. "The current motors are efficient but expensive," Jason was saying. "If we could develop something simpler but just as reliable." "What if we approached it differently?" Alexander suggested. "Instead of scaling down high-end technology, we could innovate from the ground up, focus on accessibility first, luxury second." Victoria watched them from the doorway, struck by the change in her son. His corporate polish had softened, replaced by genuine engagement. He still carried himself with confidence, but it was no longer the brittle arrogance of a man measuring everything in profit and loss. "Mom," Jason spotted her first, "tell Alexander his price point is still too high. We need these chairs to be affordable for everyone, not just the upper middle class." "Actually," Alexander said, pulling out his tablet, "I've been working on something." He pulled up a presentation titled Matthews Industries Restructuring Proposal. "The board's accepting my resignation, but they're also considering this as part of the separation agreement." Victoria wheeled closer, examining the details on the screen. The proposal outlined a complete reorganization of Matthews Industries' Research and Development Division, redirecting resources toward accessible technology development with a focus on affordability and universal design. "It's not charity," Alexander explained quickly. "There's a huge untapped market for well-designed, affordable, accessible technology, but instead of maximizing profit margins, we'll prioritize impact and accessibility. Any excess profits will fund further research and development." "You're dismantling your empire," Victoria observed. "No," Alexander corrected. "I'm rebuilding it with a different foundation. The old Matthews Industries was built on the idea that success means dominating others. This version will be about empowering them instead." Jason whistled low. "That's going to be one expensive apology." "It's not about apologizing," Alexander said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about creating something meaningful from the wreckage of my mistakes. Mom, your foundation showed me that real value isn't measured in stock prices. It's measured in transformed lives." Victoria felt tears threatening but held them back. Instead, she reached for the sketches on the table. "Show me what you're thinking for the motor design." They worked through the afternoon, joined by Sarah and other foundation members who contributed their real-world experience to the technical discussions. Alexander absorbed their input with genuine interest, his business acumen now focused on solving problems that mattered. As evening approached, Eleanor arrived with dinner for everyone, her standard response to people working late. She had begun treating Alexander with the same mix of warmth and no-nonsense guidance she showed everyone else, helping him navigate this new world of community and connection. You missed your rest period," she scolded Victoria gently, setting out plates. "Important work to do," Victoria replied, but she allowed Eleanor to wheel her to a more comfortable position. Alexander watched this interaction with a mix of guilt and gratitude. Guilt for the care he had failed to provide, gratitude for those who had stepped in to provide it. "Mom should rest," he agreed. "Jason and I can continue with the preliminary designs." "Look at you being all considerate," Jason teased. "Next thing you know, you'll be baking cookies for the volunteer meetings." "Actually," Alexander said with a small smile, "Mrs. Thompson gave me her recipe." The casual comment hung in the air for a moment before everyone burst out laughing, not at him but with him, at the unexpected humanity of it. Victoria felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. That would take more time. But it was something like hope watching her son find his way back to the person he was meant to be. Later, as they were packing up for the day, Alexander paused by her desk. "The doctors say your treatment is going well." Victoria nodded. "One day at a time, just like everything else we're building." "We," Alexander repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Through the office window, they could see the sun setting over the town, casting long shadows across the streets. They were slowly making more accessible, one project at a time. Mother and son, both changed by their journeys, watched it together in comfortable silence. Chapter 15. Healing Together. 6 months after Alexander's return, the Breaking Barriers Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The partnership with the restructured Matthews Industries R&D division had yielded its first prototype, an affordable motorized wheelchair that could be easily maintained and repaired with locally available parts. Victoria watched from the Foundation's new community center as Jason demonstrated the chair's features to a group of potential users and healthcare providers. Her son stood to the side, not dominating the presentation but supporting it, letting those with lived experience take the lead. The control system was Jason's idea, Alexander explained to an interested therapist. He helped us understand how traditional controls can be challenging for users with different mobility needs. The pride in his voice when speaking about Jason's contributions was genuine, so different from the calculated corporate praise he had once dispensed. Victoria noted how naturally he now interacted with people from all walks of life. The artificial polish of his CEO persona replaced by authentic engagement. "Mrs. Matthews." Emily Davis approached Victoria's wheelchair, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mom says I can volunteer at the summer accessibility camp if you think I'm ready." Victoria smiled at the 12-year-old, who had become something of a mascot for their foundation. "Of course you're ready. In fact, I think you'd be perfect to help with the art therapy program." The summer camp was their newest initiative, a program designed to help children with disabilities and their families learn adaptive techniques while building confidence and community. The idea had come from Alexander, inspired by Emily's story and his own journey of transformation. "I never understood before," he had said during the planning meeting, "how isolation can be more limiting than any physical barrier." As the prototype demonstration concluded, Victoria noticed Alexander checking his watch frequently. "Somewhere you need to be?" she asked when he came to help arrange chairs for the afternoon support group meeting. "Actually," he seemed unusually nervous. "The Prestons invited me to dinner. Eleanor's making her famous pot roast." Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. This was new, Alexander being included in the familiar family dinners that had become such an important part of her life. "That's wonderful," she said softly. "I'm bringing dessert," he added. "Mrs. Thompson's cookie recipe, though I can't promise they'll be as good as hers." Before Victoria could respond, Sarah wheeled up with urgent news. The state legislature had fast-tracked their accessibility bill, and Representative Wilson wanted to schedule a new hearing. "They're saying our public-private partnership model could be replicated nationwide," Sarah reported excitedly. The Foundation's office buzzed with energy as they began preparing for the hearing. Victoria watched Alexander seamlessly join the collaborative effort, offering insights about navigating political structures, but always deferring to the lived experiences of those around him. During a brief break, Victoria found herself alone with her son in the conference room. He was reviewing some budget proposals, his sleeves rolled up and his tie long since discarded, a far cry from the immaculate corporate image he had once maintained. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Your old life?" Alexander was quiet, for a moment considering the question. "I miss the certainty," he finally admitted. "Everything was so clear then, profit or loss, success or failure. Now," he gestured to the papers spread before them, filled with stories of lives impacted and communities transformed. "Now I'm learning that real success is messy and complicated and infinitely more satisfying." Victoria wheeled closer, reaching for one of the project files. "Tell me about this one." "It's a partnership with local schools," Alexander explained, animation entering his voice. "We're not just making buildings accessible, we're creating programs to help students understand and appreciate different abilities. Jason's going to be one of the youth leaders." "You've grown fond of him," Victoria observed. "He reminds me of who I might have been if I hadn't lost my way," Alexander said quietly. "His resilience, his optimism, his ability to see possibilities instead of limitations. It's teaching me so much." A comfortable silence fell between them as they continued working. Victoria noticed how Alexander automatically adjusted things to be within her reach, not with awkward overcompensation, but with natural consideration. These small gestures spoke volumes about his transformation. Later that afternoon, Dr. Martinez arrived for Victoria's scheduled checkup. These days, the doctor divided her time between regular appointments and consulting on the Foundation's healthcare accessibility initiatives. "The latest results are encouraging," she said, reviewing Victoria's tests. "The tumor continues to respond to treatment, and your overall health is stable." Alexander, who had been pretending not to hover nearby, let out a breath Victoria hadn't realized he was holding. These moments still carried the weight of their shared past. His abandonment when she had needed him most now transformed into quiet, steady presence during her ongoing battle. "Actually," Dr. Martinez continued, "I'd like both of you to look at something." She pulled out plans for a new medical center project. "We're redesigning our oncology ward with accessibility in mind. I'd value your input, both from a patient's perspective and from a design standpoint." Mother and son spent the next hour reviewing the plans together, their different experiences and insights creating a fuller picture of what was needed. Victoria understood the practical challenges of navigating medical spaces with limited mobility, while Alexander's business acumen helped identify efficient ways to implement changes. "You know," Dr. Martinez said as she prepared to leave, "when I first started treating you, Victoria, I worried about your stress levels affecting your recovery, but this work you're doing together, it seems to be its own kind of medicine." After she left, Alexander helped Victoria gather her things for the evening. "I should head to the Prestons," he said. "Eleanor was very specific about not being late." Victoria smiled, remembering her own early experiences with Eleanor's gentle but firm expectations. She has a way of helping people find their best selves. "Like mother, like friend," Alexander replied softly, and Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes at the simple truth in his words. As they parted ways in the parking lot, Victoria watched her son head toward his car, no longer the luxury vehicle he had once driven, but a practical model better suited to transporting renovation, supplies and wheelchair parts. "Alex," she called after him. He turned, and for a moment she saw both versions of him, the lost soul who had abandoned her, and the man who was finding his way back through service to others. "Save me a cookie?" His smile, warm and genuine, was answer enough. Chapter 16. New Foundations. The summer accessibility camp's opening ceremony drew a larger crowd than anyone had expected. Families from across the state had gathered at the renovated community center, which now featured expansive grounds adapted for various abilities and needs. Victoria, seated beside the podium in her wheelchair, felt a surge of pride as she watched. Alexander chat easily with parents and children. "Ready for your speech?" Jason wheeled up beside her, sporting a staff t-shirt with youth leader printed across the back. "Actually," Victoria replied, "I thought you and Alexander could handle this one." The surprise on Jason's face quickly turned to enthusiasm. Over the past months, he and Alexander had developed a natural rapport that brought out the best in both of them. The teenage boy's direct honesty helped keep Alexander grounded, while Alexander's growing wisdom helped channel Jason's passion into effective action. The ceremony began with Jason introducing the camp's mission. His words, straight from the heart, captured the essence of what they had built. "This isn't just a summer camp, it's a place where being different isn't something to overcome, but something to celebrate." Alexander followed, his corporate polish now tempered with genuine warmth. "When I first returned to this community, I thought I was here to make amends," he began. "What I didn't expect was to find a new understanding of what success really means." As he spoke about the camp's programs and the Foundation's broader mission, Victoria noticed Eleanor and Frank Preston in the audience, their faces reflecting the pride of true family. Beside them sat Mrs. Thompson, her famous cookies already half gone from the reception table. The crowd's attention shifted as Emily Davis, now one of their youth program coordinators, demonstrated some of the adaptive art equipment they had developed. "Art isn't just about what you can physically do," she explained with confidence beyond her years. "It's about expressing who you are, no matter how you need to do it." Victoria felt a gentle touch on her shoulder and turned to find Sarah beside her. "Representative Wilson just arrived," she whispered, "and she brought some people you should meet." Indeed, the representative had come with a delegation of state officials and business leaders, all interested in the Foundation's public-private partnership model. The success of their initial projects, combined with the innovative technology development through Matthews Industries, had caught national attention. "Mrs. Matthews," Wilson greeted her warmly, Your foundation's work is becoming a blueprint for accessibility initiatives across the country. We'd love to discuss expanding the model to other states. As Victoria engaged with the officials, she caught glimpses of Alexander leading camp tours. He had mastered the art of highlighting their work without making it about himself, always redirecting attention to the community members who made everything possible. The real innovation, she heard him explaining to a business leader, isn't in the technology itself. It's in changing how we think about accessibility. It's not a charitable add-on. It's fundamental to how we design everything. The day progressed with demonstrations of their various programs. Young campers showed off adaptive sports equipment developed through the Matthews Industries partnership. Parents shared stories of how the foundation had transformed their families' lives. Community volunteers discussed how working with the foundation had changed their perspective on disability and inclusion. During a quiet moment, Victoria found herself beside the art therapy station, watching Emily help a young girl adapt her painting technique to work with limited motor control. "She's a natural teacher," Alexander said, joining her. "Remember when I used to think the only value worth measuring came with a dollar sign?" Victoria studied her son's face, the gentle lines that had replaced his former stern expression, the genuine light in his eyes that no expensive suit could have provided. "You've built something remarkable here," she said softly. "We've built it," he corrected. "All of us together." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Mom, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." Before he could continue, they were interrupted by excited calls from the adaptive playground. Jason had organized a wheelchair basketball demonstration that had evolved into an impromptu game, with participants of all abilities finding ways to join in. "Hold that thought," Victoria said, watching the joyful scene unfold. "Some moments need to be witnessed." They moved closer to the playground where the game had drawn a sizable crowd. Children and adults, with and without disabilities, had found creative ways to participate. Even some of the visiting officials had been drawn into the fun, their formal demeanor forgotten in the spirit of inclusion. "This is it," Alexander said quietly. "This is what I wanted to talk about." He gestured to the scene before them. "The board has approved the final restructuring of Matthews Industries. We're reorganizing the entire company around accessibility and inclusive design, with the foundation as our guiding partner." Victoria turned to him, surprised. "The whole company? Every division, every project? We'll still be a business. We need to be sustainable, but our mission will be about creating accessibility solutions that can be implemented worldwide." He met her eyes. "If you'll help lead it." The proposal hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. This wasn't just about business strategy. It was about legacy, about transforming the empire that had once driven them apart into a force for positive change. "Together?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "Together," Alexander confirmed. "You, me, the foundation team, the whole community. It's time to rebuild everything, the right way this time." As if to punctuate his words, a cheer went up from the basketball game. They turned to see Jason performing an impressive maneuver in his wheelchair, the ball sailing through the hoop as Emily and Mrs. Thompson led the crowd in celebration. Victoria felt tears in her eyes, but they were different from any she had shed before. Not tears of pain or loss or even healing, but tears of pure joy at witnessing the power of transformation, both personal and communal. "Well then," she said, straightening in her wheelchair, "with renewed purpose, we'd better get to work. We have a lot of barriers left to break." Chapter 17. Expanding Horizons. The National Disability Rights Conference in Washington, D.C. buzzed with energy as advocates, policymakers, and industry leaders gathered to discuss the future of accessibility. Victoria sat in the green room, preparing for her keynote speech, while Alexander made final adjustments to their presentation. "The Breaking Barriers model is already being implemented in 5 states, he reported, showing her the latest data. The public-private partnership framework is proving more sustainable than traditional approaches. Victoria nodded, reviewing her notes. The past year had brought changes she could never have imagined. The Foundation's work, combined with Matthews Industries' redesigned mission, had created a ripple effect across the country. But more importantly, it had shown that true accessibility wasn't just about physical modifications, it was about changing hearts and minds. "Mrs. Matthews?" A young assistant poked her head in. "They're ready for you." The main hall was packed, with hundreds of faces turned expectantly toward the stage. As Victoria wheeled herself to the podium, she caught sight of familiar faces in the front row: Jason and Emily, now official youth ambassadors for the foundation; Eleanor and Frank Preston, who had flown in specially for this moment; and Dr. Martinez, who had become a key advisor on their healthcare initiatives. "A year ago," Victoria began, her voice clear and strong, "I found myself at what seemed like an ending. Abandoned on a dark road, facing serious health challenges, I thought my story was over. But what I discovered was that sometimes what looks like an ending is really an invitation to begin again." She shared their journey, not just the successes, but the challenges and setbacks too. She spoke about the Thompson House renovation that had sparked their home modification program, now being replicated nationwide. She described how Emily's experience had led to the development of adaptive art programs in schools across the country. "But the most powerful transformation," she continued, gesturing to Alexander to join her on stage, "has been in understanding that disability rights aren't about charity or obligation. They're about recognizing and embracing the full spectrum of human experience." Alexander stepped up to the podium, his presence no longer that of a corporate titan, but of a humble partner in something greater than himself. Together, they presented the new initiatives being launched through the restructured Matthews Industries: affordable adaptive technology, universal design consulting, accessibility-focused venture capital funds. "We're not just changing buildings or developing products," Alexander explained. "We're changing the conversation about what's possible when we truly commit to inclusion." The presentation concluded with video messages from communities that had implemented their program. Families shared stories of transformed lives, business owners talked about the unexpected benefits of becoming fully accessible, and local leaders described the positive changes in their communities. As applause filled the hall, Victoria felt a familiar wave of fatigue, a reminder of her ongoing health battle. But before she could quietly excuse herself, Alexander was already there, attentive but not hovering, supporting but not smothering. "Need a break?" he asked softly. She nodded, allowing him to wheel her off stage to a quiet area where Eleanor waited with water and her medication. The three of them had developed an unspoken rhythm in managing her health needs while maintaining her independence. "You should see the social media response," Jason called out, wheeling over with his laptop. "The hashtag Breaking Barriers Together is trending nationwide." Victoria smiled at his enthusiasm, but was more moved by the genuine relationships that had developed between all these people who had become her extended family. Alexander, once so isolated in his corporate tower, now sat comfortably on the floor next to Jason's wheelchair, discussing their next youth leadership program. "Representative Wilson wants to meet with us," Sarah announced, joining their group. "She's putting together a congressional committee on disability rights and wants our input on federal legislation." The news sparked excited discussion about the possibilities for national-level change. But Victoria found herself watching Alexander's face as he listened to everyone's ideas, noting how naturally he now shared power and platform with others. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her observation. "I'm thinking about transformation," she replied. "About how breaking barriers isn't just about physical accessibility. It's about breaking down the walls we build in our hearts." Alexander was quiet for a moment, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. Their own barrier breaking had been as much about emotional accessibility as physical adaptations. The afternoon brought a series of workshops and panel discussions. Victoria and Alexander split up to attend different sessions, each bringing their unique perspective to the conversations. She found herself in a discussion about healthcare accessibility, sharing their experiences with Dr. Martinez's redesigned oncology ward, which had become a model for other facilities. During a break, Victoria wheeled herself to a quiet balcony overlooking the city. The Washington Monument stood tall against the blue sky, a reminder of how far their small-town initiative had come. Alexander joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Remember when you first came back?" she asked, accepting the tea. "When you said you wanted to learn how to build something that matters?" He nodded, leaning against the railing. "I thought I was giving up an empire. Instead, I found a kingdom of greater worth." "A kingdom we're building together," Victoria added, thinking of all the lives they were touching, all the barriers they were breaking. The moment was interrupted by Emily, excitedly waving a tablet. "You have to see this. The Matthews Industries adaptive technology announcement is going viral. People are calling it a revolution in accessible design." But Victoria was more interested in the way Alexander's face lit up, at Emily's enthusiasm, than in the news itself. This was the true revolution, the transformation of a man who had once measured everything in profit margins, now finding joy in changing lives. "We should head back," Alexander said, noting the time. "The afternoon sessions are about to start." As they made their way back to the conference hall, Victoria couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, but the real growth had been in the connections forged, the hearts changed, the barriers broken not just in the physical world but in the way people saw and understood each other. "Ready for the next session?" Alexander asked, his hand resting lightly on her wheelchair. "Ready," Victoria replied, knowing she meant more than just the conference agenda. They were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to continue breaking barriers together. Chapter 18. Full Circle. The autumn air was crisp as Victoria wheeled herself along the newly installed accessible pathway in the Preston Farms garden. Eleanor had outdone herself this year. The flowers were a riot of color, and the vegetable garden had been modified with raised beds that anyone could tend, regardless of mobility challenges. "The tomatoes are coming in nicely," Eleanor commented, kneeling to check the plants. "Frank's new irrigation system is working better than we hoped." Victoria smiled, remembering how the simple garden adaptation had sparked a whole series of agricultural accessibility initiatives. Local farmers had started implementing similar designs, and Matthews Industries' agricultural division was developing new adaptive farming equipment. "Mom!" Alexander's voice carried from the house. "Dr. Martinez is here with your test results." The hue. Regular checkups had become family affairs, with the doctor sharing both professional expertise and friendship. Today, however, felt different. The latest round of tests had been more comprehensive than usual, marking a year since Victoria's initial diagnosis. Inside, the kitchen table was set for tea, Eleanor's response to any significant moment. Alexander sat beside Victoria's wheelchair, trying to mask his anxiety with casual conversation about the Foundation's latest projects. Dr. Martinez spread out her files, her expression warm but professional. "The results are quite remarkable," she began. "The tumor has responded exceptionally well to treatment. While we'll need to continue monitoring, the latest scans show no signs of active disease." The news took a moment to sink in. Victoria felt Alexander's hand slip into hers, squeezing gently. Eleanor quietly wiped tears from her eyes while continuing to pour tea, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Of course, this doesn't mean we can get careless," Dr. Martinez continued, but she was smiling. "You'll need regular checkups, and we'll maintain a careful watch. But Victoria, you've done something remarkable, not just in terms of your health, but in how you've used this challenge to create positive change for others." "We've all done it together," Victoria corrected, looking around at these people who had become her family in ways that transcended blood. Later that afternoon, the Foundation's community center was buzzing with activity. The weekly support group had evolved into a vibrant community hub where people came not just for help, but to offer their own unique contributions. Jason was leading a training session for new wheelchair users, his confidence and expertise growing with each passing month. Emily supervised an adaptive art class, her creative solutions inspiring both students and teachers. Sarah managed the ever-expanding administrative demands with quiet efficiency. Hard to believe this all started with a house renovation, Alexander mused, watching the activities from the doorway of Victoria's office. It started with a choice, she corrected. Many choices, actually. Yours to come back, mine to rebuild rather than retreat. Everyone's choice to see possibilities instead of limitations. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Mrs. Thompson had arrived with a fresh batch of cookies, the recipe she had finally perfected with Alexander's help during their weekly baking sessions. The sight of her former titan of industry son proudly displaying his baking skills still made Victoria smile. The Congressional Committee approved the National Accessibility Initiative, Sarah announced, wheeling up with the latest news. Representative Wilson says our model will be the foundation for the new federal guidelines. The announcement sparked spontaneous applause throughout the center. Victoria watched as people congratulated each other, regardless of their role or ability status. This was what true inclusion looked like, not just accessible spaces, but accessible hearts and minds. We should celebrate, Alexander suggested. Not just the legislation or your health news, but everything. How far we've come, how much we've all grown. The impromptu celebration came together naturally, with everyone contributing what they could. The Preston Farms garden provided fresh vegetables, Mrs. Thompson's cookies took center stage, and the community center's kitchen, designed to be accessible for all, buzzed with collaborative energy. As evening approached, Victoria found herself back in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The same garden where not so long ago she had wondered if she had any future at all. Alexander joined her, pulling up a chair. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the house. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked quietly. "When I left you on the road?" Victoria considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not with anger anymore, but with understanding. We both had to break before we could rebuild something stronger." "I was so wrong," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "About everything that mattered. But you found your way back," Victoria reminded him, "and in doing so you helped create a path for others." Inside, they could hear Jason starting one of his famous storytelling sessions, his voice animated, as he shared another adventure from the summer camp. Emily's laugh rang out, followed by Eleanor's gentle admonition about indoor voice levels. "It's strange," Alexander reflected. "I spent years building what I thought was success, never realizing I was actually constructing my own prison. Now helping others break down barriers, I've never felt more free." Victoria reached for her son's hand, remembering all the times she had done so throughout his childhood. The gesture was the same, but everything else had changed. Both of them transformed by their journey, their relationship rebuilt on a foundation of shared purpose and genuine understanding. "We should head in," she said, noting the evening chill. "I believe Mrs. Thompson is teaching you her secret pie recipe tonight." Alexander stood, gently helping her navigate the garden path, even though they both knew she was more than capable on her own. The help wasn't about necessity anymore. It was about connection, about choosing to support each other even when it wasn't required. As they approached the warmly lit house, filled with the sounds of their chosen family, Victoria felt a profound sense of completion. Not an ending. There was still so much work to do, so many barriers to break, but a recognition that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, and the darkest moments can lead to the brightest transformations. "Ready?" Alexander asked, holding the door. "Ready?" Victoria replied, wheeling forward into the light. Chapter 19. Rising Tide. The White House rose garden was in full bloom as Victoria wheeled herself into position for the ceremony. Beside her, Alexander adjusted his tie, no longer the power statement of his corporate days, but a subtle pattern that Emily had helped him choose for the occasion. "Nervous?" he asked, noticing her adjusting the speech cards in her lap. "Not about the speech," Victoria replied. "I'm more concerned about Jason. He's been unusually quiet all morning." Their young protégé sat nearby, dressed in a new suit and fidgeting with his wheelchair's controls. Being chosen as a youth speaker for the signing of the National Accessibility Act was a huge honor, but Victoria knew it meant more than that to him. This was personal. The garden was filled with disability rights advocates, politicians, and community leaders from across the country. Eleanor and Frank Preston sat in the front row, their presence a reminder of how far they'd come from that rainy night when they'd first opened their door to a stranger in need. President Harris approached the podium, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Today," she began, "we gather to sign into law an act that represents not just policy change, but a fundamental shift in how our nation views accessibility and inclusion." Victoria listened as the president detailed the key points of the legislation, many of which had been directly inspired by the Breaking Barriers model. The act would establish nationwide accessibility standards, fund innovative adaptive technology development, and create tax incentives for businesses implementing universal design principles. But perhaps more important than the legal framework, the president continued, is the story that inspired this movement. We have with us today Victoria Matthews and her son Alexander, whose journey from personal tragedy to national transformation embodies the very spirit of this legislation. As planned, Jason spoke first. His wheelchair glided smoothly to the podium, one of the first models, produced by the reformed Matthews Industries, now the leading developer of affordable adaptive technology. 2 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, I thought being different meant being less. Then I met 2 people who showed me that our differences aren't limitations, they're opportunities to create something better for everyone. His speech wove together personal experience with passionate advocacy, moving seamlessly between touching anecdotes about the summer camp and compelling arguments for universal design. Victoria felt tears in her eyes as she watched this confident young man who had become like family. When it was Victoria's turn to speak, she took a moment to look out over the assembled crowd. She saw Emily with her parents, the Davis family, now running accessibility consulting programs in schools nationwide. Mrs. Thompson sat with a group of community leaders, her famous cookies having become a symbol of their grassroots movement. Change, Victoria began, rarely comes in the way. We expect. Sometimes it arrives in moments of greatest challenge, disguised as an ending when it's really a beginning. She shared their story, not just the dramatic moments, but the small victories that had built upon each other. The first house renovation, that sparked a community movement. The summer camp that became a model for youth empowerment. The partnership between the foundation and Matthews Industries that proved accessibility could be both sustainable and profitable. But the real change, she continued, gesturing to the diverse crowd before her, happens in hearts and minds. It happens when we stop seeing accessibility as a burden and start recognizing it as a bridge to human potential. Alexander's part in the ceremony was more technical, focusing on the practical implementation of the Act's provisions. But Victoria noticed how he consistently redirected credit to the communities and individuals who had shaped their approach, demonstrating how thoroughly he had transformed from a corporate autocrat to a humble partner in social change. After the signing ceremony during the reception, Victoria found herself surrounded by people eager to share their own stories and plans for implementing the Act's provisions. A young entrepreneur showed her designs for adaptive sports equipment. A school superintendent discussed plans for inclusive education programs. Each conversation reinforced how their local initiative had grown into a national movement. Mrs. Matthews, a quiet voice interrupted her discussions. She turned to find a teenage girl in a wheelchair, clutching a well-worn copy of the Foundation's first newsletter. I started a Breaking Barriers chapter at my school. Would you sign this? Victoria felt Alexander's hand on her shoulder as she signed the newsletter, adding a personal note of encouragement. The girl's mother stood nearby, tears in her eyes, mouthing silent thanks. Later, as the reception wound down, Victoria found a quiet moment with her son in a corner of the garden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully maintained lawns, while the distant sound of celebrations continued. "Did you ever imagine this?" Alexander asked, gesturing to the scene around them. "When you first started the foundation?" Victoria. Thought back to those early days, the community center meetings, the first home renovation, the gradual building of trust and purpose. "I imagined making a difference," she said, "but this is beyond anything I could have dreamed." "You know what I remember most?" Alexander's voice was soft, reflective. "The moment I first walked into your office at the foundation, I thought I was there to apologize, to somehow make amends. Instead, I found a whole new way of measuring success." They watched as Jason demonstrated his wheelchair's features to a group of interested officials, his natural leadership abilities shining through. Emily was deep in discussion with the Secretary of Education about expanding their art therapy programs nationwide. Sarah efficiently coordinated with White House staff, ensuring everyone's needs were met. "We've built something remarkable," Victoria observed. "No," Alexander corrected gently. "We've built something necessary. The remarkable part is how many people were waiting for someone to show them it was possible." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the rose garden, Victoria felt a profound sense of rightness. The journey that had begun in darkness on a rainy road had led them here, not to an ending but to a new beginning, one that would ripple out to touch countless lives.